Welcome to this community call on January 25th. It's wonderful to have you here. We have a packed agenda for today. Hopefully you may have noticed that we literally tweeted about 15 minutes ago that there's been a new v1.6 release. So myself and Arta from Microsoft and me from Diagrid will talk about that. Then we'll have Phil talk about Dapr from a Gopher's perspective, redoing part of his talk that he did at GopherCon back in November of last year. Jeroen will do an introduction to a new special interest group on an API proposed for Dapr, and he'll talk about what that means. And then we'll have time at the end for open discussion, where you can ask questions or anything else that's on top of your mind. But as always, feel free to post questions in the chat window as we go along, and we'll be happy to try and answer them. So with that, let's dive into the excitement of the fact that we've just released a v1.60. And what was fantastic about this release, it was the highest number of contributors we've ever had for a release. It keeps growing with each release. We had over 57 contributors. So I wanted to say a huge, huge thank you to the entire community. You know, it was an amazing contribution that we have. You know, Dapr wouldn't be anywhere where it is today without the contribution of all these people, you know, from the community and, you know, and around it. So thank you for everyone. What was great about this release is, as always, we had lots of stability and bug fixes inside it all, but particularly it was focused on a lot of the component certification and the component lifecycle. Arta will dive into this a lot more, but as you may know, components go through a life cycle. They go through alpha, which is when they get first submitted, and they basically have no test criteria around them all. Beta, where they have a stronger set of conformance tests, and then they go to a stable version, which is they can be used inside production. So we'll talk about the life cycle of some of those. We introduced new components, updates to existing ones, and there was one component that was actually deprecated. The SDK as well had a lot of changes within inside them, mostly focusing on a lot of the preview API features that we've done in sort of, you know, for the routing API that we've added, and also the APIs around configuration and for filtering. So what I suggest that you do is that you can go and click and look at the release notes inside here. If you open up the release notes inside here, we have a fairly comprehensive list of what happened with inside the component improvements. You know, which components were added as new stable components. Particularly, we'll talk about this stable candidate means that it's still a beta component right now, but we're confident enough that this is going to become a stable candidate in an upcoming release. The new capabilities you can read here added to existing components. These were the two new components that were added: an Alibaba parameters secret store and Oracle Cloud Infrastructure Object Store. And then you can read here also about the improvements to the SDK. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to Arta, and he's going to dive into a little bit more detail around some of the release improvements. Arta.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I should be sharing my screen now. So let's start with the stable components. So we made significant progress on the certification tests for many components in 1.6. And we also made a small change in the criteria to call stable, where after doing the certification tests and make some fixes on the components, we decided to wait one release before we claim the component is stable. The reason why is during the process of certification, we might find bugs and fix things and make changes, and we'd like to give the community one release to report issues. But we don't want to wait forever, because otherwise the components would take a while to become stable. So we decided to rely heavily on tests still, but still give the community time to report bugs, especially critical bugs. So these are the components that we're calling now stable candidate. They should be marked stable in 1.7. I won't highlight all of them, but you can take a look at the documentation to see how we use. There might be breaking changes, but we, as usual, avoid those. But one of them was actually, we made significant progress on actually completely rewriting which is the Azure Event Hub's PubSub. And the rewrite is part of the certification process that we're going through that for the component as well, but we did not write the certification tests yet. So for that reason, that's not yet stable, but it's a complete rewrite. And that will basically address a critical problem in this component that was reported by a community member and was fixed by Mukuda with this rewrite, which is to basically the Event Hub PubSub component was ignoring the topic name. So it would basically automatically connect to Event Hub with a fixed name and ignore totally the topic. With this change, the main difference you're going to notice is that now the component connects to an Azure Event Hub namespace, and the topic name will map to an Azure Event Hub. So there is the biggest difference with this implementation. And we could also added support for automatically provisioning the Event Hub based on the topic. Depends on the credentials you have. If you don't have credentials for that, the auto provision is not done, which is kind of a nice feature because sometimes in production, you don't want the provisioning to be done by Dapr. It's actually preferred to do the provisioning before start your application. So, so that was a major fix that would definitely benefit people using Azure. Another thing that we did is we have made some APIs, some new APIs available in the past releases. And a big one was the configuration API. This time we made an effort to add those to the SDKs. So you're gonna see that in the .NET SDK, in the Python SDK, in the Java SDK. And I think that was it for this round. Another API is the query state API that allows you to basically do some queries on state store. And again, it's another alpha API, and we added support for that in Python and JavaScript. And we're gonna have more SDKs with this API in the upcoming release. We just didn't have the time to do it all in 1.6. So please try out these two new alpha APIs and give us feedback. The query state API and the configuration API are both alpha, and they are subject to breaking changes. So that is also one thing I wanna mention today. These changes, so the feedback is very important because we wanna make sure we get those breaking changes in as early as possible before we claim that the API is stable. Next, we have there was another error that we found while we were debugging stability with our E2E tests. We found that if applications have a configuration with two active state stores, the Dapr runtime would pick the first one. And the first one is not necessarily alphabetical order. It was kind of a non-deterministic result based on how the component was reported back to the sidecar. So this gave some odd behavior in our E2E test, and we realized, oh, this can also happen in a production environment, and we should not allow that. So now if you have a production environment where you declare two active state stores, but you should not do that, that's definitely in the configuration error. The sidecar will fail and not initialize. Okay, and that is actually a good behavior because you might be facing some undeterministic state reading from actors, which you definitely don't want. Another thing that we did is for the reminder partition, we have some issues that we identified while troubleshooting our E2E tests, and we put some fixes in for how we save reminders in a partitioning way. This is an alpha feature as well, but there's no breaking changes as a result of these fixes, which is a good thing overall. If you continue back in the release notes, we're gonna take a quick look at our breaking changes section, and by looking at that, you're going to observe that we remove the cloud state store component. We deprecated the gRPC metadata API. And we also have a fix for actor state exception handling in the .NET SDK. These are the breaking changes and deprecation notices for this release. And I hope you try 1.6 soon. Give us feedback on the release, and that's it on my end.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and in fact, many of the features in this release we showed in a previous community call earlier this month in January, on January 11th. So if you go back and look at that call, you'll see the demo of the query API. Mukunda went through a lot of the event hubs rewrites and what the features inside all that. So go back, check out the previous call in January for demos of the features inside this release. And now it's ready, and you can go and try it yourself. Fantastic. Thank you, Arthur. Let me just share my screen here again. So now we're going to dive onto our second topic of using Dapr from a Gopher's perspective. And I will hand over to you, Phil.
All right. Let me get my screen shared.
Perfect.
And yep, so these are the same slides you were just seeing. I'm just doing them here. So as Mark said, this is somewhat reusing some of the content that we delivered at GopherCon. And so this isn't the entire slide deck, but it really is what I like to call the villain slides of any good presentation or any good story, right? So at the beginning, there's the what's the problem statement, and then how do we combat it and have victory, right? And how do we do that with Dapr? So just from a Gopher's developer or a Gopher's perspective, right? Looking at some of this, like we've kind of reoriented these are actually common slides that are part of the community deck for sharing information about Dapr, but we've just kind of tweaked them a little bit to come at it from more of a Gopher point of view, right? And so it kind of talks about, you know, yes, there's a lot of boilerplate code, and with Go, there's even more so, right? It's just even amplified. When you're dealing with Go in larger organizations, really any organization, because Go is kind of just now starting to make its way into the enterprise, you're going to have to coexist with services written in other languages. And so, you know, part of the difficulty is that, you know, some companies might do, for example, authentication a certain way, and now you have to build that into your service, and you might have to port a lot of code and so on. So keep that in the back of your mind. And then, you know, when it gets into being a good constituent in a cloud microservice environment, doing instrumentation and security and adding resiliency, like Go can do all those things, but it's just a lot of tedious instrumentation of the code. And really that's kind of the message to take home here, is that Go really actually is a fantastic language for building microservices. It's not hard. It's actually, there are quite a few frameworks out there that make it achievable. The thing though is just tedious. There's a lot of instrumenting of code, and you know, you'll get this skewing of the amount of lines of code toward boilerplate far outweigh the actual thing you're trying to make that service do with business logic, right? And that's kind of, you know, one of the goals of Dapr is to kind of minimize that stuff and really make it so that you can focus on what matters, which is, you know, what your service is intended to do. So that kind of gets into the demo. And I think here I'm going to switch it over to my IDE because I have the same image loaded there. And so the demo here is got a couple different scenarios, but overall it's basically kind of an inventory management type scenario where we have at the very far left, the entry point into the demo and the logic is a pub subtopic called inventory. And Dapr uses something called cloud events, which is just a cloud native way of structuring your events so that there's common fields that you can expect for inspection, like the ID, right, or the type, right? Those are things that you probably need to make use of in your application logic in order to perform or to react to that message, right? So the next step in this demo here, we kind of have it broken up into swim lanes, which is denoted by these little dotted lines. And so there's a new feature that it's still in alpha, but it's called pub sub routing. And it is now in the Go SDK. So we will actually see the usage of that in this demo. So hot off the presses capability being used in this demo. But what we're basically doing is based on the type, what we have is a scenario where we want these different types of widgets, because these are, I'm sorry, of types of inventory to go to different backends, right, on the very far right. And all those backends, those Dapr through its API is going to help us eventually get the data there, right, and also retrieve it. But it's going to happen in 3 different ways. And these are going to be common scenarios you're going to find in any organization. So the top one, where the type might equal widget, we're just going to put things in a relational database. And one thing to note here is there is a database API kind of being proposed, but I think a lot of cases, there's still going to be people that, whether it's Go or Java or JDBC or .NET with its relational database drivers, like I think there's still going to be people that really prefer using that. So Dapr wants to be, you know, something that meets people where they are and be piecemeal, and you can adopt or not adopt any piece of it that you want. And so this is going to be an example of that, where we're just going to use we're actually just going to use a straight up SQL driver to connect to SQL, but we need to know how to connect, right? And so where Dapr can help us out there still is the secret store. So in setting up this flow, I can on startup say, hey, Dapr, I need to know how to connect to my Postgres database. Can you go fetch me the connection string? And that'll come back. And then I can use that to initialize my connection to the Postgres database. And then from there, Dapr really moves out of the way. It gets out of your way, and it's just, you're just straight up talking to Postgres. And that's kind of the desired experience there. Moving on to the next one with gadgets. That actually ends up just going to a state store, key value store. It could be, again, with the power of Dapr, you can take Redis out. I chose Redis because it gets installed with Dapr init, but you could certainly pick any of the other implementations in there. And of course, the code that you're writing in your service remains the same. So that's the second flow. And then all other products, right? So this is kind of like the default case, if you will, in a switch statement. Well, you can think of pub sub routing as almost like a switch statement, right? So case else, what we want to do is say that we have this legacy product service, and someone's put a nice Dapr service on top of it that we want to invoke. And from there, the magic of doing whatever products, with products that need to be done is just handled behind the scenes, and we can treat that like a black box. But of course, we still need to invoke it, and we want to use the secure mechanisms that Dapr provides to do so. So specifically using the name resolution feature, which can be one of many implementations that we won't get into, but most critically, the communication between the two Dapr sidecars is encrypted with identity baked in, and that you can secure that and say that, you know, service A can talk to service B, but service C cannot talk to service B, right? Those sorts of scenarios. So now that we kind of understand the swim lanes, this gets into a way of structuring code that is pretty common with Go programmers. So if I were to draw a parallel, in languages such as Java or others, we tend to organize our code by type, or like the type of component it is. So for example, controllers, models, repositories, those sorts of things, right? We kind of stick everything into those groupings. And you know, that's kind of served us well. That's like actually in most of my career, that's mostly what I've seen. Making the switch to Go, however, it kind of takes a different approach. Like Go's outlook on things is to make packages based on purpose, right? So, and I like to think of that as just a way of saying by feature. So the way I've structured this code is that each of these swim lanes is broken down into a separate feature package, each with its own service, which is kind of like what I would say implements these save operations. And then the repository behind it, which is either going to be Postgres or Redis or a service invocation, right? So we're not going to dig into the code line by line here, but really what I'm trying to do is give you a way to navigate how to look at this code for good examples if you're to think about adopting using Dapr and Go together in your company. And so, you know, I think the biggest thing to look at is like each of the examples repositories. So for example, this is the one that uses the state store. And so I have an abstraction We'll get into the abstractions on top of the abstractions. Like this probably wouldn't be how I would exactly do things in my company, but I want to show you kind of different ways of using Dapr from an API standpoint. So we'll get to that in a second. So we've got the state store here. I can crack open the widgets, and that's going to go to Postgres, which in Go, I am using a very popular library called jaxc pgx, right? And you know, if you're into Go, you're probably very familiar with this package, and it gives you the basic ways of executing SQL statements and scanning the rows out on selects and so on. And one little point I'll make too is when you're building APIs, most companies have an agreed upon error format for, like, let's just say it's a REST API. Like there's some sort of error structure. So one of the things I've tried to weave in here is that errors are almost like a cross-cutting concern. However, it funnels its way back up to the transport, like the actual REST call or the curl, command or whatever. So I just really put a simple example of doing something like that in this errors package, right? So this is kind of the standard structure I'm trying to return. So this is just a little bit of a sidebar, but I found that this trickles its way all throughout your component code, no matter what you do, and getting the company to align on how errors work across APIs is kind of an important thing. So I went ahead and threw that in there. Do it however you want, but this is just an example. So that's how I would say to navigate each of these features. The next thing I want to show you is how to integrate with Dapr itself. So this is, think of this as calling the APIs of Dapr to fetch some data, right? And so each of those is going to the Dapr API via a client. And this is what I like to call the choose your own adventure section of this demo, because I've kind of done it every which way a Gopher developer can. And the reason I did this is because I think I've been involved in so many different conversations building APIs from scratch where people want to either use the standard library or something like fast HTTP. They want to use Gorilla Mux, or they want to use some other Mux. And, it's almost like every new project we revisit a lot of these decisions, and not that that's bad. It's just, it seems like even though all APIs may be kind of structurally or conceptually work the same, the choices we make are different over time, especially when libraries improve or there's some new library to choose from, right? So I went and kind of took that extreme, and for the custom, so I'm going to say this, I did this through just writing custom code, both in HTTP and gRPC, in order to call Dapr. And you can kind of see, what's going on here if you're not familiar with what the SDK is doing, which we'll get to in a second. But in a sense, this is kind of what the SDK is doing for you. It reads this environment variable, which Dapr injects into your application so you know how to connect to it. And from here, it's using a library called Fiber, which is wrapper around something called fast HTTP, which is a short way of saying this is not using the standard library in Go for doing the HTTP stuff. So if you decide to do this, this is kind of not how the SDK works. But at least, this demo has your back, right? So again, as a Gopher developer, you can kind of pick and choose which path you want to go down. And this at least lets you see the mechanics of each of those choices, right? So I'm not going to get into all the different lines of code here, but just this is how each of these operations is implemented using Fiber as an HTTP client. Moving on to the gRPC, again, this is something the SDK does for you, but if you want to kind of use the gRPC protodes directly, you're absolutely empowered to do that. And so here's basically the state store and secrets all written as just pure gRPC calls, right? So let's move on to the SDK, because one thing I want to stress is the more you do this, the more you'll start seeing, hey, I'm kind of reinventing what the SDK does. And I think it's important to be aware of, yes, you can start out and maybe roll some stuff on your own, but you may come to a point where it might just make sense to go ahead with the SDK and use it as it is. And here you can compare and contrast on your own, but the SDKs looks very similar in terms of how it helps you call these different operations. In fact, I would almost say, like, it's a very lightweight wrapper around the SDK, which makes sense, right? So you can look at all the differences. And then from a server standpoint, and so to back up to the demo, that what I just showed you with the clients is you calling into a Dapr API. There's also this concept in Dapr called an app channel, which is kind of saying my application is exposing either HTTP or gRPC for Dapr to deliver me basically events, at least for now. There are a couple components that kind of have watches in them now, in the newer stuff, but at the end of the day, at the heart of it, bindings and pub sub are the main features that will deliver your application events. So there needs to be a way for Dapr to reach into your application and call it. And so that's what the server piece of these implementations are. And again, not to go through the code, but it really is just a way of saying, hey, here's the way to do it through raw gRPC, using the protos directly from the Dapr project, right? I'm just going ahead and because Dapr is implemented in Go, I can just actually pull those in directly and use them. I don't have to generate them. And now I'm able to implement the server side APIs, which you'll see on invoke is when a binding gets invoked, listing the input bindings. And then for subscriptions, list topic subscriptions is called this for programmatic selection of which topics your application is interested in, and so on. So you can look at that. And there's some things I did in here to accommodate that feature structure. I'll leave it at that. In fact, the README kind of this repo talks about that a lot more. And then just here's the HTTP way of doing this. So, and of course there is an SDK for solving this as well. So that's kind of the basic overview. Again, I would encourage you, I'm gonna go back to the repo, is in more detail, it actually talks about the design choices. I kind of skimmed over them here, like why I'm doing something like fiber that's a little off the beaten trail, just to kind of say that Dapr is still very easy to integrate with, even if you're using something non-standard. And it really, the point of this is to level you up as a microservices developer with the core, what I'm considering the core things that that a Gopher developer would use. Mainly these types of components, right? And it talks about the application flow and the scenarios. So, if you're interested in Go, interested in learning in Go, and also in conjunction with using it with Dapr, I think this is a great place to start. Our slides from the conference, the GopherCon conference, are here, and it's more or less what you've already seen me talk about. But with that, I think I have kind of gone over the overview. Again, I would say reach out if you have any questions. Think of this as like a very expansive example that helps you make choices as to how you want to use Dapr.
Thanks, Phil. That was great. Do you think you could just post the link to your repo into the chat? Yep. That would be great so people can find it. And some great takeaways there from a Go perspective. Is there anything that you particularly would summarize it at the end there?
That's a good question. I wasn't anticipating that one. I think it's, with Go, there's always this, what's the size of your API? Like there's a lot of Go APIs I've seen teams build that are just really small. And I'd probably just encourage you to integrate with Dapr, directly and really understand how it works, right? Like you are what you eat is one of the phrases I love to say. And so having that mechanical sympathy with the thing that you're using is pretty important. But if you get to a point where your services are more evolved and you want less boilerplate, do consider the SDK. And, if there are things in there that are missing, certainly create issues. And, we want the SDK to be as idiomatic as possible. And yes. I think it's pretty good from my standpoint, honestly saying. So I don't know, I guess that's what I would say.
Okay. Actually, it's one of those interesting points in that we actually see the SDKs are very tailored towards the actual community themselves. Because if you look at the Java SDK, it's kind of very different in terms of how it's approached and how you build the applications themselves. So it's very interesting that we're getting this polyglot nature around the SDKs that serve very, very different communities on top of Dapr in very different, diverse ways.
Yeah, and Johnny actually made a good point. It was not mentioned in the README whatsoever. But the structure I followed is following something called clean architecture, hexagonal architecture. Is just a way of doing separation of concerns. So you'll see that I broke apart the repository from the transport code from the business logic. That's exactly what Johnny's talking about in the chat. And so this is just yet another example of how from the get-go, you can start structuring your application so that if another transport comes in, like I want to expose a service that does both HTTP and gRPC, that I don't have to restructure my entire application, right?
Yeah, pretty good. While we're on this topic, actually, if anyone wants to come along and talk about Dapr from a particular SDK and community perspective, if you want to come along and present about Dapr from a Java developer's perspective or a Python developer's perspective, in the way that you've used it, we'd love to see that, because seeing those different diverse perspectives from the different language and the communities really helps people get to grips with it all. So thanks, Phil. That was fantastic. Okay, so with that, let me share back my screen here a moment. And we are now going to move on to our next topic, which is going to be presented by Jeroen, and he's going to give us an introduction to the API Special Interest Group. So, Jeroen.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to share my screen. And let me know when you can see it.
Yes.
Okay. Hey, everyone. Let's talk about special interest groups and what do they mean in the context of Dapr. So before we talk about the API specification special interest group, which is the first one that we formulated officially this morning, actually, let's talk about what a special interest group from now on be pronounced as ZIG is. So what are the goals of a special interest group? As its name suggests, it basically groups people into a group that can research and deep dive into specific areas that are of interest either to the community or to the maintainers of Dapr. So the first thing I think ZIGs do is really empower the community by delegating responsibility into the community to research, to go ahead and do research, and then suggest to maintainers basically ways of action or assist maintainers in driving major initiatives. So, maintainers are basically spread thin in any open source project. Dapr is no exception to that. Maintainers are more like Jedis. We're more like keepers of the peace. We're not meant to, spread out on every issue because there are many issues, and for Dapr, the runtime, there's 3 maintainers today. That's myself, Arthur, and Long Day. And we can't obviously be everywhere. And so Dapr didn't have ZIGs up until now, but what we've seen is that Dapr, because it has so many different subjects like pub sub and bindings and state management and configurations, all of these are really big issues, then it makes sense to basically empower the community to create these groups around them, which can research new APIs or new features, and then communicate that to maintainers and basically help maintainers delegate the responsibility of driving the features forward. And so the goals are really to assist maintainers both in decision-making, to drive initiatives that maintainers think are worthwhile investigating, and also to give the community a proper way to research something and have it be on the maintainer's radar to be able to review it. So when is a ZIG created? First and foremost, once there is a problem space that's interesting either to the community or to maintainers. So a ZIG can be asked to be started by the community. It needs to be vetted on by the Dapr steering committee, not maintainers. The steering committee, if you don't know what it is, go read about it. It's the governance model that drives the overall project. It currently has 7 members from 4 different companies. And the steering committee basically governs and confirms and also removes special interest groups. And then the second, of course, is when we have an existing problem space that needs long-term attention, community feedback, and maintainers just can't get to it. So, for example, I'm just gonna pick one off the top of my head that came up recently is SDKs, right? So there's many Dapr SDKs, they're being more added. There's a request for a Ruby SDK and someone who wants to basically drive that. So there needs to be some sort of a special interest group that governs how SDKs are being maintained. What are the criteria for 1.0? That's a really good question that Arthur, a Dapr maintainer, brought up. So this is an existing space that we might decide to create a special interest group for based on existing needs. Who can join a special interest group? Basically, any Dapr member. in order to become a Dapr member, go read about it in our Dapr community repository. It's github.com/Dapr/community. You basically need just a little bit of community contributions, then you can ask to be part of the special interest group, and you will be included in its discussions. So what are the properties of a ZIG? It works in the open, meaning it updates the community via GitHub. Every ZIG will have its own dedicated GitHub repository where designs can be shared on a public drive that everyone has access to, and issues are basically being discussed inside of the GitHub repository for that special ZIG. Second of all, the ZIG itself doesn't have any decision-making authority. It provides recommendations and conclusions to maintainers and the Dapr steering committee, which then decide if these recommendations and conclusions can be accepted and what acceptance mean in terms of implementation. And then if a ZIG itself, which is started by a chair and a co-chair, needs escalation, meaning if a ZIG only has 2 members and they can't agree on something, they bring it up to maintainers first. And then if maintainers cannot agree, that rarely ever happens, never happened in Dapr before, that goes to the steering committee where voting takes place and there's always a quorum, so decisions can be resolved in there. This is an example of how Kubernetes ZIGs work. This is an overly simplified example. I think there are like, don't quote me on the number exactly, but there's more than 15, I think, ZIGs in Kubernetes. So you see the Kubernetes maintainers on top. Kubernetes is a pretty monolithic type of organization, many repositories, but the main Kubernetes repository is singular. And under it, there are many ZIGs for networking, for security, for applications on Kubernetes, etc. And the workflow of ZIG is pretty simple. You have the ZIG members who are standing members of the Dapr community, just Dapr organization members. They have their own GitHub repository. They basically have an issue which they research or are trying to reach conclusions for regarding what to do for the future of Dapr. In that case, it can be an API, it can be a feature, it can be, criteria for any number of things in the Dapr world. And it's being discussed on GitHub issues so that it's open to everyone. Then all of these conclusions basically flow up to maintainers who review and discuss this with the ZIG members and review all the documents on the public drive. And then once maintainers have a conclusion, they bring that up to the steering committee, which then basically votes and approves whatever conclusions have reached it. And if there are any action items to take, the steering committee approves it for maintainers, and maintainers are the one to actually take the action items that came out of the ZIG and make sure that they're implemented in the way that was captured inside of the specification or work item that was written by the ZIG members. So today we're talking about a proposal which has been accepted by the Dapr steering committee beginning of January for an API specification for Dapr. And this really means taking the API of Dapr, which is not really formalized at the moment. For example, for the HTTP API, we don't have any official spec. We have a Swagger for the service invocation API, which is something that a community member did a while back, but nothing more than that. And we have Protos for the gRPC APIs. And the goal is to take these and separate them out so that APIs can become front and center for Dapr and really be decoupled from the implementation. So in other words, we want people who want to drive features into Dapr to go look at the API specification first, think about how this new API and a change to an existing API or removal to an API affects the whole Dapr ecosystem in regards to its existing APIs and its future, and then make a proposal for that API spec. APIs have alpha, beta, and stable levels. We have that today, just like we have for components. And the goal of separating the API specification from the implementation is really to allow for more implementations of Dapr, implementing these API specs and make it easier for implementations to consume them. If you want to have, like, let's say, a Rust-based Dapr implementation for the edge, it might need to consume the API spec. That's not so easy. If you're consuming it from a Go-based repository, it's kind of weird. And then, of course, the big overall item is to just enable more vendor participation. So the Dapr steering committee today is involved with multiple companies. 2 of them are major cloud providers. That's Alibaba Cloud and Microsoft. The goal is basically to make the API vendor neutral too, and not just implementation specific. And by allowing that, we hope that cloud vendors with their own services can maybe adapt the Dapr APIs as like a front API for their internal services. So that's another thing that we want to achieve long term. Yeah, and I think that's the end of the slide. So if you want to see the API Zig repository that was created this morning, that's one of the decisions that we took in the Dapr steering committee. So like we said, every Zig has its own repository. This is the beginning of it. This is the API specification. Zig, you can take a look at all of the issues and everything else that's going to be inserted here by the Zig members in this repository. You can raise issues yourself, you can fork it, you can submit PRs, you can join the Zig if you want to, just open an issue here and ask to be joined. And the beginning of this special interest group really comes down to this issue, which was opened February 18, 2021 by nobody Ian. And he basically came up with this proposal. He's a community member that came up with this proposal to basically split Dapr APIs. And he looked at it from the point of view of other cloud providers basically using the Dapr APIs to front their services. After a bunch of discussions here that we made, we actually came up with more reasons why you'd want to separate the APIs from the implementation. And so we have two community members who have contributed a lot to this discussion, Flood and Kevin Turn. They're currently the co-chairs of the special interest group. They're the maintainers of the repository. And we also have a dedicated Discord channel for it. So if there is any discussions being made in this special interest group and you want to see it in a more live real-time fashion, then in the GitHub repo, you can just click on this Discord channel here. Hopefully the link works. Yeah, and it does. You can see Zig API here, and other topic channels is where we will be hosting all of the Discord channels for the different Zigs. So yeah, that's it. I'll open it up to questions if there are any, and an action item for anyone seeing this. If you have any special interest in anything Dapr related, and you think it should be part of a special interest group, please talk to us, open an issue in Dapr, or just reach out to a maintainer or steering committee member via Discord or our community repository. Thank you.
Fantastic, Yaron. Does anyone have any questions on that? All right. Okay, that's it's good to see these special interest groups because it allows to have a diverse set of opinions coming in. But also, as you said, offloads work to other people so that they actually bring their ideas and allow us to expand in the community. So it's great to see that happening. All right, we have a returning person. Phil is going to come back and he's going to show us the demo of it actually running code. So Phil, present your screen and show us the app as the finale.
Yeah, like, oops, totally forgot to do that. And by the way, really excited about what Yarn just presented. The SIG sounds really exciting. And it's definitely been a need for quite a while to have the API documented. All right, good stuff. So in the make file of this example, this is the choose your own adventure. You can pick which implementation you want to run. So the two customs, HTTP and gRPC, and then the two protocols for the SDK. So it doesn't matter which one you pick because they all actually work the same as designed. And so I can show you, hold on, the Zoom bar is in my way. Move said Zoom bar. So here's my Postgres database, right? It's got nothing in it. And I can just want to show you I'm not pulling any tricks here. Even through the API, I can say make get all, and it'll just return a bunch of 404s for each of those three scenarios we talked about, right? So nothing exists yet. And I'm going to run this, and hopefully the demo gods like this. So let me move this again. So I just went ahead and did the quick route where I went ahead and sent 3 different messages all at once, one for the widget, one for the gadget, and one for the just other, which is the other product. I call that a thingamajig. And you'll notice real quickly over here, I have this products window running, which is running this service right here, right? And nothing, we don't care about what's happening here, but just for example purposes, it's logging that it saved it. And so now that's there. And for the widget, that is in the Postgres database, right? Go back to that. And so now you'll see the widget row is in there. Fun, fun. And then in here, there should be, yes, there's a gadget, right? And it has basically the cloud event stored in there for that. So that's it. It's real. And now you know the data is all in its place, and I can say make get all again, and you'll see that each of the things come back now through the API. So that's basically it. Sorry about that, missed that little detail, but.
That's fantastic, thank you. Just good to see it operate in action. And you posted the link to your repo, yes?
I did, yes.
Okay. All right, so let me just share my screen here now. So before we finish up on the open discussion, I just did want to say and put a call out for, if I just pull over here on my Discord channel here at the moment, we created a Discord channel a couple of weeks back for community call chats, where you can actually talk about things that you'd like to present on these community calls. We're always looking for people to present on these calls. We'd love to hear about ideas. If you actually go and look today, in our community repo here, we actually have the agenda items that we want to propose here, but we just think a lot of people were sort of missing these agenda items. You see, this is the one for today, and we try to include, you can put chat inside here if you want about things that you suggest inside it all. This is the next one coming up on February the 8th, and you can put some ideas inside here. But meanwhile, we thought having a place that you could just post ideas and noodle on a few things inside this community call chat channel would be a great place if you want to put some ideas inside here. So please, whatever language you're using, we particularly like case studies. So if you've used Dapr inside your organization on a project, we'd love to just come and hear about how you're using it all. If you just want to do a demo of a simple thing that you built, nothing is too large and nothing is too small. We'll take on anything really. We just want to kind of get anything from early usage of Dapr to maybe you've used it in sort of a complex application, they've used it all. So please kind of post some ideas inside here. And so with that, I'll just return back to open discussion, and here just leave it for anyone who wants to kind of post any particular questions that they have, or just open up your mic and we can actually just take questions that way. So feel free to put anything in the chat window, or ask a question if there's anything that people want to ask.
Sorry, I have a question. It's sort of a more general question. It's not targeted at anything in this call.
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm working on a project where multiple teams are working on the same Kubernetes cluster, but working in different namespaces. And my team wants to install Dapr, but the administrator for our Kubernetes cluster is concerned about Dapr having accidental impacts on other teams' namespaces. So I know there are ways to namespace components so that they can only work in their particular namespace. But are there any methods when you're installing Dapr on Kubernetes to make it so that Dapr can only look inside of and inject sidecars into certain namespaces? I haven't been able to find anything on that, and I wanted to check with the people here at this call.
Can I answer the question? This is Arthur. So this is a question that we have received before. I would say that today Dapr is a cluster concern, which means you do one Dapr installation per cluster. On the other hand, Dapr will only inject the sidecar if your deployment has the Dapr annotations. So if you install Dapr and don't put the Dapr annotations, there would not be any sidecar injected. So the other teams that are working different namespaces, they're not going to be impacted. So that is I think the solution for the situation. Now, a different discussion that we have received in the past is like, okay, different teams want different Dapr versions running. Yeah, that is a more complicated discussion. We definitely don't support that today. But I think if your admin is okay with the fact that you only get the Dapr sidecar injected if you ask for it as part of your annotation, then I think maybe it's a path forward. Anybody has other opinions on this?
No, I think what you said is pretty accurate, and we can certainly make the Kubernetes the Dapr control plane be namespace aware, so that it'll only be able to create resources or look at components for one or more specified namespaces. That should be a pretty easy thing to do because we're using QBuilder and QBuilder supports that out of the box. But yeah, Alex, just like Arthur said, if you don't enter through deployment, you're not going to get sidecars. So that's the way you do that currently, if you don't want to get any sidecars in a given namespace.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. I will tell that to my administrator and see what happens. Thank you.
Yeah, just one more thing. It's Dapr has a sidecar, and fortunately, a sidecar is a very, I would say, misused term. So like Dapr is not a service mesh, right? Most service meshes will actually automatically inject sidecars by default into most namespaces. So Dapr is not like that. You need to, like we said, explicitly tell it to inject a sidecar into a namespace.
And you are also aware that the Dapr control plane can get installed inside its own namespace, yes, independent of other namespaces. I presume you're aware of that.
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Any other questions or topics? Okay, all right. Well, with that, well, please feel free to kind of use the Discord channels for ask questions. As always, I'll put my call out again for if you want to present inside these. And thank you once again for attending this call, and see you in 2 weeks' time on February the 8th.